All right, so we're in volume 2 of Barclay's Matthew books. So I did want to interject something because I read the intro this time, that, you know, Barclay's books were written in the 50s, but there has been some editing since then. I don't know if Sarah or Susan or Kitten, if you guys read this, there's a little intro written by his son. And apparently Barclay himself was pretty strong-minded, that he liked to write stuff, get it done, that's it, you know, and didn't really want to do much editing. So they've done some editing and a little bit of update to address apparently some passages that he wrote that were a little bit more dated in terms of, you know, from the 50s. And also, and I had noticed this, so to clarify for y'all too, you know, the passages that he translates, but then sometimes in his commentary, he'll quote, you know, other verses or something or refer back to it. And so on those, though, those quotes within his commentary, those are from the Revised Standard Version. They're not his translation. So, because I would read it and I was like, that's not quite how it was worded, you know, in the passage at the beginning of the section. So that's why there's that difference. So, all right, so Matthew 10, you know, was Jesus preparing the disciples for their ministries and teaching them, right? And so now moving into chapter 11, Jesus is talking to the general laity or lay persons. You know, it's not just his disciples that he's talking with now. So if somebody, we're on page 1 of the second volume. So, and Sarah seems to always read first. So,
okay.
So Sarah, if you'll read verses 1 through 6.
Okay. And when Jesus had completed his instructions to the 12 disciples, he left there to go on teaching and to go on making his proclamation in their towns. When John had heard in prison about the things that the Anointed One of God was doing, he sent to him and asked him through his disciples, "Are you the one who is to come, or must we go on expecting another?" "Go back," said Jesus, "and give John the report that you are of what you are hearing and seeing. The blind are having their sight restored, and the lame are walking. The lepers are being cleansed, and the deaf are hearing. The dead are being raised up, and the poor are receiving the good news. And blessed is the man who does not take offense at me."
All right, so here for chapter 11, Barclay, in the 6 different passages, has described them as showing different accents of the voice of Jesus. Accents is the word that Barclay uses. So tone or overall, yeah, sort of that tone, attitude for the different passages. So this first one, Barclay describes as having an accent of confidence. All right, so so starting first off with John, and Barclay talking about John first and John's career, and he describes the career of John as ending in disaster. So how did that sit with you guys, that John's career ended in disaster? Does that?
I didn't care for the word. It ended, you know.
Yeah, I didn't see John as being
No.
Well, been cut off, pretty disastrous.
Yeah. That was disastrous, but he was not a disaster.
Yeah. I did like the picture that Barclay painted in terms of John having lived his entire life outdoors, and I think maybe this is why he was calling it a disaster. How disastrous it would be for someone who had lived outdoors forever to be stuck in a cell, maybe without even a window. Now that I'm thinking on it, but I thought that was a rather vivid word picture when I read it.
And he knew he wasn't going to get out too.
Right.
Right. I mean, I don't know. Anyhow, I didn't like the word disaster either. All right. So, and Barclay says that, John's career, that he spoke too fearlessly and too definitely for his own safety. He definitely was very clear and direct about his message. So, however, John's message was that he had been really sure that Jesus was the one to come. The Jews had been waiting for the Messiah to come. They were waiting for the Messiah. And so, and that was one of the, there was a lot of eager anticipation, for that. And so John sent his, so now John's in jail. So he's, I'm sure, wondering what's going on. I would be, obviously, what's going on, anxious to know that. So he sends this message asking, are you really who is to come, or shall we look for another? All right. So remember, he's asking that question. So why would John be asking that question? Think back to Jesus' baptism and how John was at that point. All right. And what John was saying at that point. Why would John be asking that question at this point? So Barclay says that some people think the question was asked not for John's sake, that John didn't really need to know that, but it was for the sake of Jesus's disciples that he was asking that question, to get them thinking about that. And so another reason that maybe John asked that was because of, a way that John's own message was so firm and direct that maybe there was some impatience on his part, that he was like, I want this boat to get on the, this project to get happening. So maybe he was being impatient. When is Jesus going to start on action? Because he's done a lot of teaching. When is he going to blast his enemies? So maybe that was why he was asking. And that maybe the question was nothing less than faith and hope dawning. I love that wording by Barclay. I did like that it was a question of dawning faith and hope. He had seen Jesus at the baptism, and in prison, he'd been thinking more and more about him. And the more he thought, the more certain he was that Jesus was the one to come. So now he wanted to put those hopes to the test with this question. So why do you think John would have asked that question? Are you really the one to come?
I just find it difficult. I mean, John and Jesus knew each other. They were close. They were cousins. If John agrees to baptize Jesus and he baptizes him, and then, the clouds part and God says, this is my son in whom I am well pleased, listen to him. That's all the street cred I would need. And I would not, at the end of all of that teaching, turn around and say, so are you the one? I don't know. I don't get this, how many more signs do you need?
Well, but you got to remember, it depends on which gospel you're reading as to whether John heard God speak or not. One of the gospels, and I think it's Mark, Jesus is the only one that hears those words.
I guess I always interpreted that John's in prison and he's probably hearing what's going on through messages from his disciples, and that he might be thinking, like Judas and some other disciples thought, that this isn't the Messiah. This isn't someone coming to save us. This is, this isn't raising up an army. He might have had I always thought John might have thought that he's not acting like the Messiah would, and not what I expect the Messiah to be. So he was questioning, are you really the one?
Yeah. When are you going to start?
But
Right, because, that was an ongoing question throughout the New Testament, throughout the Gospels. People were wondering, is this really him? The disciples so many times, different disciples at different times. we're, trying to figure this out.
Well, on page 3, when it says the first point, when John says, are you the one who is to come, or shall we look for another? And point 1 says, some people think that the question was asked not for John's sake at all,
Right.
but for the sake of his disciples. I thought his disciples meant John's disciples, not Jesus's disciples, because John knew he was not getting out of prison because he had attacked Herod for marrying Philip's wife without.
Marrying his
Of
sister-in-law.
course.
Right.
Right, so he knew he was done, but he had to have somebody pick up his disciples.
Mhm.
So that's the way I read that. He's
Mhm.
looking for someone else to lead the ones following him. Was the way I read it.
Yeah, and somewhere in the past, I remember a discussion about this topic, and maybe not at this point in history, but John's following was bigger than Jesus's. Got better press, whatever, and that this may have been John's way of trying to say, or the gospel writer's way of saying to everybody that was following John, that's fine, but now it's time to move over here and follow Jesus.
Well, the Old Testament says Elijah is going to return before
Yeah.
the Savior.
Right. That's in the
And-
next section. Right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
so people at that point, John the Baptist didn't see himself as the Elijah person. I don't think.
Yeah. Whether or not John did, but what did, maybe did Jesus. So we're going to talk about that in the next section. All right. So this question, are you the one who is come, or must we go on expecting another? And how does Jesus reply? He's not saying, well, this is what I'm doing. Jesus replies, give John the report of what you are hearing and seeing.
Yeah, decide for yourself and then go back and tell him.
Right.
Look at what I can do for you and see what I have done for others.
Right. Because, go back and tell John what you're hearing and seeing. And then talks to the blind having their sight, the lame are walking, the lepers are being cleansed, the deaf are hearing, the dead are being raised up, and the poor are receiving the good news. And blessed is the man who does not take offense at me. So Jesus is talking, go back and tell him all these good things that are happening.
Well, I also think John the Baptist is confused because I agree with Claire. He was also thinking a military leader, and Jesus was not that.
I think most of the Jews were expecting a military leader. Wasn't just John.
Well, I think some of the disciples thought that too,
Right.
because
Right.
Judas thought he was going to force Jesus's hand by turning him over. I'm going to make him reveal who he is. And when he realized he was wrong, that's when he went and committed suicide, because he realized, oh, he's not going to be a military leader.
But if you or I or anyone had been walking with Jesus, I mean, I can't imagine the privilege and the awe of just, actually not only hearing his teachings, but seeing these things happen. If I were there witnessing that, even if I had been told it's going to be a military coup, it's going to be a military coup, and Jesus is teaching, no, love thy neighbor, I don't know that I would be clinging to the military aspect of it. If I was witnessing the peaceful transformations, the power of peace.
But they were still they were in an occupied land. We can't, at least I can't imagine what it would be like to have China ruling America. Because that's in today's world, that's the equivalent. They wanted the Romans out. Regardless of all this nice talk about peace and love, Rome was in their backyard.
Well, look at the feelings you can stir by talking about carpetbaggers after the Civil War. The Southerners wanted the Northerners out of the South. I mean, that'll still bring up strong feelings today.
Yeah.
Right. Right. And also we have to remember, we know the story of the cross. and the resurrection.
Yeah, John the Baptist did not.
John did not.
Right.
The disciples did not.
That is a good point.
You know, the disciples did not. We know the whole story. You know, they did not. And it's, you know, for me also, this is another reminder about what human behavior is like. You know, we tend to want to win. We want our side to win. We want it to win. So, you know, and that's not what Jesus taught. You
Well,
know?
I still say you can sum up the whole Bible with love wins. The whole,
Right.
everything in the Bible, eventually love does win. And it is a battle, for lack of a better word, but not a military. Well, in Revelation, there is going to be a military battle, but. You know,
Right. But that's the ultimate message of Revelation is
love wins.
love wins.
Yeah.
All right. All right. Let's move to verses 7 through 11. All right. So who would like to read that?
I'll read.
Okay.
I usually follow Sarah.
It's
Yeah,
not,
they
Susan, you
were-
read the third one. All right. So somebody else might have to read one because if we get all the way through, we've got 6 passages.
All right. When they were going away, Jesus began to speak to the crowds about John. What did you go out to the desert to see? He said. Was it a reed shaken by the wind? If it was not that, what did you go out to see? Was it to see a man clothed in luxurious clothes? Look, the people who wear luxurious clothes are in kings' houses. If it was not that, what did you go out to see? Was it to see a prophet? Indeed, it was, I tell you, and something beyond a prophet. This is he of whom it stands written. Look, I am sending before you my messenger, who will prepare your way before you. This is the truth I tell you. Among those born of women, no greater figure than John the Baptist has ever emerged in history, but the least in the kingdom of heaven is greater than he is.
Whew.
Yeah,
Yeah.
because we all have benefit of Jesus on the cross, and nobody before that time did.
Right. Right. So here, you know, first we have John, the message from John from prison saying, hey, you know, should we be expecting somebody else? Or are you really the person? So Jesus goes on to speak so highly of John. All right. Goes on to speak so highly of John. All right. So backing up. So he says, did you go out there in the wilderness just to see a reed shaken in the wind? You know, and that was sort of like an idiom at the time, that that phrase, a shaken reed, was kind of a proverb. I mean, yeah, it says kind of a proverb for the commonest of sights. You know, that's just something common that you see every day. Okay. You know, down here at the beach, you know, there's all kinds of reeds and stuff. You can just see them, the beach grass and all that stuff. You see that all the time, right? Okay. So, but a shaken reed can also mean a weak waver, or one who couldn't stand firm against the winds of danger. All right. Somebody that really couldn't stand firm in their beliefs when things got tough. So that imagery. Did they go out to see somebody dressed in fine clothes? No, we know that John wore a hair shirt, you know. Did they go out to see a prophet? Okay. And that's what Jesus goes on to talk about, that the prophets are the foretellers of the truth of God, that prophets are those who are in God's confidence, you know, that they have that special relationship with God. And he quotes from Amos that surely the Lord God does nothing without revealing his secret to his servants, the prophets. Then prophets are 2 things. First, they're people with a message from God. And second, they're people with the courage to deliver that message, which clearly describes John.
I think it's
Um,
interesting that the Muslims and the Jews believe in Jesus, but he was a prophet, not the Son of God.
Either way, he carried a pretty powerful message.
Yeah, yeah, and they believe he existed and that he was very powerful.
And that his message was very important.
Yes.
Yes, yes. All right. So, so Barclay goes on to talk about that John was something more than a prophet. You know, like we were saying earlier, the Jews believed that Elijah was going to come back to herald the coming of the Messiah. And so to this day, you know, at the Passover feast, there's an empty chair for Elijah to come and sit, you know, when it's time for him to come and say that the Messiah is coming. That, you know, John was nothing less than the herald of God.
I didn't know it said in Malachi 4:5 that very statement. I don't know that I've ever read Malachi, but it says at the top of page 7 that Jesus declared that John was nothing less than the divine herald. I didn't know that was in the Old Testament.
Yeah, so the passage from Malachi is, lo, this is Malachi chapter 4, verse 5. I will send you the prophet Elijah before the great and terrible day of the Lord comes.
It mentions him by name, Kathy?
Yeah, Elijah. I will send you the prophet Elijah.
Oh, it says Elijah. It doesn't say John. Okay.
No, it says, I will send you the prophet Elijah.
Okay.
So that's what the point that Barclay is saying is that John the Baptizer serves the role of Elijah.
Right. Well, I have to be honest. If I lived back then, I would have thought literally Elijah, not John the Baptist.
Yeah, I would too.
Yeah.
And I would think that the great and terrible day of the Lord comes as the second coming. So maybe Elijah's second coming back.
Right. Whatever, you know,
That was kind of in time, you know,
Right.
the great and terrible day, not the Messiah coming, but
Yep. 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 And the debate of millennia as far as what the second coming is. Yep. Okay. So tremendous tribute by Jesus of John. You know, even though this question, you know, John raised this question, Jesus responds first by telling them what you're seeing and hearing, but then goes on to give this voice or accent of admiration for John.
And Jesus doesn't do anything to try to save John or get him out of prison or prevent his death either, that we know of.
Right.
He lets him be, I guess, a martyr, for lack of a better word.
Yep. Yep. So Barclay goes on and describes John as being the lamplighter, you know, and tells this story about this guy who would go out and light the lamps every evening. And it turns out the guy was blind, but he was lighting the lamps in this town. And so, you know, John didn't know the whole story. Didn't know what was going to come. But so serving like that lamplighter who was blind. And so, all right. So Barclay also talks about how God needed John. That I see him as using John as being that Elijah voice for Jesus, as being the Elijah for Jesus, perhaps. All right. So then the next passage still refers to John the Baptist and Elijah. So would somebody like to read 12 through 15?
yeah. From the days of John the Baptist until now, the kingdom of heaven is taken by storm, and the violent take it by force. For up to John, all the prophets and the law spoke with the voice of prophecy. And if you are willing to accept the fact, this is Elijah who was destined to come. He who has ears to hear, let him hear.
All right, so verse 12 can be a pretty challenging one, or a confusing one. that the kingdom of heaven is taken by storm from the days of John the Baptist until now. So that imagery of violence, we were talking earlier about we want to win. We want our side to win. And, like looking at what's happening in Israel and Palestine over the past couple of weeks, human behavior turns to violence really quick. Luke had a different way of presenting this verse. In Luke, which is in chapter 16 of Luke, since then the good news of the kingdom of God is proclaimed, and everyone tries to enter it by force. So a little bit different perspective from Luke. So Barclay goes on to say it's clear that at some time Jesus said something in which violence and the kingdom were connected. So he feels pretty confident that Jesus made that statement, but then how Matthew presents it and how Luke presents it are a little bit different. So Luke says that people storm their way into the kingdom. Matthew says that from the time of John until now, the kingdom of heaven suffers violence, and the violent take it by force. How does this sit with you?
Well, the church, the Dome of the Rock is now a Muslim mosque, and it used to be Christian. So some people would say that means it already has been taken by force.
Barclay goes on to say, in looking at the Luke and the Matthew versions, and he suggests that maybe what Jesus said was always my kingdom will suffer violence. There will always be antagonism and people who will try to break up the kingdom and snatch it away and destroy it. And therefore, only those who are desperately in earnest, only those in whom the violence of devotion matches and defeats the violence of persecution will in the end enter into it. Is what Barclay is wondering if that's what Jesus was trying to say.
Maybe he was alluding to his eventual crucifixion and the violence of that, sort of equating himself to the kingdom of heaven.
Mm. Yeah. All right, so Barclay goes on to say that it seems strange. So in verse 13, for John, verse 13 is for up to John, all the prophets and the law spoke with the voice of prophecy. But because Barclay makes the point that it was the law itself which confidently declared that prophecy would not die, that the voice of prophecy would not die. In Deuteronomy, it says, I will raise up for them a prophet like you from among their own people. I will put my words in the mouth of the prophet. So anyhow, Jesus is telling the people that John is the herald and the forerunner whom they have waited for so long. So Jesus reinforcing that John is the one saying, hey, Jesus is here, Jesus is coming.
Well, it had been 400 years since, I don't know, which prophet in the Old Testament was last? Was it Malachi or was it one of the other prophets? I don't remember. But it had been 400 years since the people had a prophet.
Wasn't that Daniel?
I don't remember who was last.
I think Daniel was one of the last written books in the New Testament, seems like.
Old Testament.
And the Old Testament, yeah.
Yeah, I don't know who was last, but I do know it had been 400 years since they had had anybody bring them any new word from God.
So anyhow, these passages here in chapter 11 really seem to be Jesus trying to get the people to see, the connection that he has to God and how this fits with the law is how it strikes me altogether.
John the Baptist and Jesus had a message and they gave the message, but the people didn't like the message. They wanted a military leader to overthrow Rome. So I think the people heard them. They didn't like what they heard. They wanted something else. They wanted Barabbas because he was going to overthrow Rome.
It's an ongoing process. I mean, we're still,
Yeah.
Wikipedia says that Malachi was the last of the biblical prophets.
Good
That
job.
John the Baptist is considered the last prophet.
Okay.
Now,
All right.
wait a minute. I got a question about the way that was worded. Malachi is the last book in the Old Testament, but I don't know that necessarily means it was the last one written. How did you ask your question?
I said, who was the last prophet before John the Baptist? And it's last prophet or final prophet is a term used. Well, I'm not on the same page. Hold on.
Well, anybody can add Wikipedia. so
Yeah, anyone can
you're
get it
right.
with.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. So it's, yeah.
Judaism, it says, considers Malachi to be the last of the biblical prophets, but believes that the Messiah will be a prophet and that there will possibly be other prophets alongside him in the Mandadeism. John the Baptist is considered the last prophet. Mandaeanism, what is that? I don't know what that is.
All right. Might have to do some research on that this week. Oh, I'll ask my minister friend that's here. I'll ask Joe. All right. So moving to page 11 in Barclay's book. Does anybody want to read 16 through 19? I don't know who has the book. I know Susan, Kitten, and Sarah and I do.
I only have the electronic, so I can't sync up the page numbers.
I can do that again. I'll do it.
Okay.
To what will I compare this generation? It is like children in the marketplace, calling to their companions and saying, we piped to you and you did not dance. We wailed and you did not mourn. For John came neither eating nor drinking, and they say, the man is mad. The Son of Man came eating and drinking, and they say, look, you, a glutinous man and a wine drinker, the friend of tax collectors and sinners, but wisdom is shown to be right by her deeds.
All right. So just like we were talking, Jesus is saying, hey, things aren't going quite the way you expected. You wanted something specific, like children saying, hey, we played music for you and you didn't dance. We wailed, but you didn't mourn, And I didn't realize that Barclay says that the Scots call this contrary behavior. So I didn't know that it was Scottish to say you're being contrary. So anyhow, and then, obviously John, as in the previous passages talked about, John was not quite what was expected, and obviously people didn't go out in the wilderness to see the reeds shaking or to see him all dressed up. They went out to see a guy who sounded a little weird, looked pretty weird, and had a very different message from what they were expecting. And he's saying that, hey, that's what I am too. I'm not doing what you expected. My message isn't what you expected. No. And then ends by saying, wisdom is shown to be right by her deeds.
I don't know where I am in this conversation exactly, but you were talking earlier about there will always be conflict, there will always be war and all this stuff. And I keep hearing something speaking to me about, and Kathy, you said human beings very quickly jump to violence. And so in the midst of all this, I hear the term a justifiable war. There's always a reason to justify, this is a good war. This is because, and you said we want to win. So there's always winners, always losers. There's one on one side of the fence, one on the other side
And
of the
God's
fence.
always on your side,
God's
no
always,
matter whatever side you're
yeah,
on.
God's in every foxhole on both sides, right?
Mhm.
So it's all confusing to me, but as human beings, we come down and say, oh, we can do these atrocities because it's a just war.
Mm.
I'm getting off a little bit here on another thing, I guess, but that's what's rattling in my mind as you're speaking.
Yep, it is complicated. It is. Years ago, I don't know if you guys know who Paul Crow was. Paul Crow was a disciple that was very active in ecumenical efforts for the disciples, and oftentimes at an international level. And I don't think this is original to him, but I remember he being the one that said it, that peace is not the absence of war, but the presence of justice. Which put a different perspective on.
But the difficult part, as I see conflict in the world, is everybody thinks their point of view is just. So what is justice?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Right. Yep. All right, well, let's move on to verses 20 through 24, and I'll read these. All right. Then Jesus, began to reproach the cities in which the most numerous of his deeds of power had been done, and because they did not repent. Alas for you, Chorazin! Alas for you, Bethsaida! For if the deeds of power which happened in you had happened in Tyre and Sidon, they would have been repented in sackcloth and ashes long ago. But I tell you, it will be easier for Tyre and Sidon in the day of judgment than for you. And you, Capernaum, is it not true that you have been lifted up to heaven? You will go down to hell, for if the deeds of power which happened in you had happened among the men of Sodom, they would have survived to this day. But I tell you, it will be easier for the land of the men of Sodom in the day of judgment than for you. So whatever it was that happened in Chorazin, Bethsaida, and Capernaum, whoa, because we know what happened in Sodom.
Well, I think it was simply that they got to hear Jesus speak and the Old Testament cities did not. So the Old Testament cities were doing sinful things, pagan worship, child sacrifice, whatever. But that doesn't compare with hearing Jesus and rejecting Jesus. So I think what I'm hearing is Chorazin, Bethsaida, and Capernaum got to hear Jesus and rejected him, and that's a much higher sin than anything they did in the Old Testament. That's what I interpreted that to mean. I don't know.
Yeah, no, I think, Barclay talks about the sin of people who forgot the responsibilities of privilege and the sin of indifference. There's a lot of horrible things that happen because of the sin of indifference.
Well, it says in Revelation that of the 7 cities, Thyatira, I think, is the worst because they're lukewarm. I think in Revelation, I will spew you out of my mouth because you're neither hot nor cold. You won't choose. You're indifferent. You're lukewarm. You're in the middle. And God would rather you, it sounded like to me when we read Revelation in fellowship, that it's almost like God would rather you choose and be wrong than sit on the fence and make no choice, have no opinion. Because at least if you make a choice and you're wrong, we can work with that.
Mm-hmm.
But if you have no opinion, it's like.
Right. One of the most destructive things is apathy.
Yeah. Well, look at Germany. I mean, so many people were apathetic when changes were made. Had more people stood up and fought against the change, things could have been gone a different way. There are a lot of apathetic people in the world today. There are people who won't read a paper, won't watch the news, won't talk about politics. We're not talking about that. And that doesn't make the issue go away by refusing to talk about it.
No, it doesn't. No. No. So, yep. So Barclay titles this section "The Accent of Heartbroken Condemnation." So, because I do think it was painful for Jesus to see that, as it
Well,
is.
he condemns them because he preached there and they refused to hear him.
Okay, so then the next accent is an accent of authority. So let's see where Jesus goes after this condemnation. Susan, you want to read this one, 25 through 27?
Well, Susan just read. I'll read this.
Oh,
one.
Sarah, sorry. Got the S's mixed up in my head.
Yeah, right. We're both short. At that time, Jesus said, I thank you, Father, Lord of heaven and earth, that you have hidden these things from the wise and the clever and have revealed them to babes. Even so, Father, for thus it was your will in your sight. All things have been delivered to me by my Father, and no one really knows the Son except the Father, and no one really knows the Father except the Son, and he to whom the Son wishes to reveal his knowledge.
All right, so Barclay is saying that, now Jesus is talking about his experience of the rabbis and wise men rejecting him, while simple people have accepted him. So he's condemning that intellectual pride. That one scholar named A. Plummer reportedly said, the heart, not the head, is the home of the gospel.
I like that.
Yeah, that if it's all just an intellectual exercise for you, you've missed the message.
Well, I think too much about the stuff I read, and I wish it were simpler for me, but I ask too many questions. And I have discussions with people. I've had discussions with almost all of you about issues in the Bible, and you see things a different way than I do. And that's why I really value Sunday school. You learn so much by listening to how other people interpret the same verse you just read.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah. So Jesus goes from talking about these towns being condemned because of their indifference, and then talks about, well, so what's the next thing you do? And then it's what's in your heart, and what you do with that. So at least that's how I take it. And also he makes the point, no one really knows the Father except the Son, and he to whom the Son wishes to reveal his knowledge. So this is can be considered a pretty strong theological kind of thing. Is how does this all work? What role is Jesus in Jesus helping us to see God, helping us to experience God through his love?
Three more verses and you can finish chapter 11.
All right, let's do it. All right,
I'll read.
Okay, go kitten.
Come to me, all you who are exhausted and weighed down beneath your burdens, and I will give you rest. Take my yoke upon you and learn of me, for I am gentle and lowly in heart, and you will find rest for your souls. For my yoke is easy and my burden is light.
All right, so the Greeks had a saying, supposedly, it is very difficult to find God, and when you have found him, it is impossible to tell anyone else about him. Woo. The way to know God is not by mental search, but by giving attention to Jesus Christ. Barclay says, for in him we see what God is like. So we have gone from John raising the question, hey, you know, are you really, who are you really? What are you really doing? And Jesus answering him by, you know, it's what you see and hear, to Jesus and giving admiration for John, talking about violence in the kingdom and what role violence plays, and comparing, you know, talking about indifference and what difference that makes, and then coming to me when you're exhausted and weighed down beneath your burdens. So the power of this the whole message in chapter 11. You know, somebody asked me this morning, because the friends that are here now with us are my friend Barbara, her Sunday school class. So they all wanted to know what we were doing today. And I said, we're talking about a pretty challenging chapter. I think it is. But that when you put it all together, the power of the message in chapter 11.
You know, when you're poor and you're hungry and you're homeless and you're sick, you're looking for help. But the rabbis were following all the rules and doing everything they knew to be right. They were in a totally different place than the poor, hungry, homeless people.
Mhm.
They were following all the rules, doing their best to follow the rules and the laws. And here comes this guy that's preaching this new and different thing and is pulling people out of the synagogue, and they're not giving their money, putting their money in the till when they come in. And they just saw him as competition and needed to be rid of him.
Well, there's a chapter where the disciples are being told what's going to happen when they go out, you know, and persecution. And here we have a whole chapter of Jesus kind of responding to what people are saying. First, John the Baptist, he mentioned, you know, he alluded to what the people, the wise people, the people who study the Bible are doing. And he alluded to what the cities are doing that have already heard his message once, you know, so he's kind of sharing stories, starting to share stories, you know, with them about what's happening, what's actually happening out there.
Mhm. No, so going back to what you were saying, Kitten, you know, the law was an external control. Whereas Jesus is saying, you know, it's what's in your heart, which is an internal control. You know, it comes from inside of you.
Well, the
So-
disciples traveled with him 3 years, and I don't think they got it until Pentecost.
Would you have?
No, I'm saying I would have thought he was crazy. Yeah.
Yeah, they always seem like little dumb lumps, you know. They're told and told and told, and because we know the end of the story,
Right,
look at it differently.
right.
But they were constantly told, and they told, I'm going to rise in 3 days. And after he was crucified, it was just like everyone was worried about, well, what do we do next? Well, I guess I'll go back fishing, you know, or whatever. I got to get out of here because we'll be persecuted or killed if we're you know, if we're seen. So it was just like,
Yeah, they didn't get it.
they didn't get it until like you said, until Pentecost.
40 days later at Pentecost. Yeah,
Right. And
50
we're
days.
still working to get it too.
I agree.
Right.
We're
Right,
still
that's why
working
we
to
do
get
this
it
every
too.
week.
Right. We need this ongoing booster shot.
Yeah.
We need a weekly booster shot. So, all right.
Good job,
Um,
Kathy. You got the whole chapter.
I got the whole
Yay.
chapter. All right.
Good
So I wanted
job.
to read Barclay's last sentence in talking about this chapter. The burden which is given in love and carried in love is always light. It's always a light burden when it's carried in love. So, and I think there's, you know, the experiences here, we all can speak to that. So,
The
anyhow,
old, the old saying, he ain't heavy, he's my brother.
that's right.
Aw.
That's right. Yeah.
I'll be at camp. It's Memorial Day weekend. It's spring work weekend at camp. So I'm leaving Friday. So Sarah's going to teach for me next Sunday. I'll be at camp like Friday to Tuesday or Wednesday, whenever I run out of work
wow.
to do. So I'll teach 2 weeks from today.
Okay.
Thank
All
you, Sarah.
Well, maybe next year I'll be able to go to work weekend.
That would be
fun.
lovely.
Yeah, yeah.
I'd
I'd
like to
love for all of
thank
you to
the, I'd like to thank the Bucket Brigade for all their hard work.
Yeah. All the adventure of finding everything for the
Oh,
bucket.
yeah. It was adventurous at times.
Yes. All right. Well, blessings to each of you this week.